All right, welcome back to today, chapter 10. We're going to talk about agency agreements. All right, the agency agreement is how I, as the managing broker, would become employed, and that is the correct term. I am employed by my client. You guys work under an independent contractor agreement with me, okay? So these agency agreements that we're going to talk about are actually employment contracts, all right? Not necessarily a real estate contract. We're going to describe and talk about the different types of listings, because there's 3 different types of listings we're going to deal with. Talk about the different kinds of buyer's agency agreements that we're going to deal with. Talk about all of the terms that they use inside of a listing. We're not actually going to go through a listing form, but we're going to talk about some of the paragraphs that are important inside of that listing form. All right, we'll talk about the buyer's agency agreements. Any questions about what we're going to do or how it's going to work? Sweet. All right, yesterday we talked about agency. We talked about there was an agency agreement, or we created agency between the client and the buyer. And if you remember, I had those little arrows that showed that they're connected. Today we're going to talk about how you actually create that agency and what that agency means. We had the fiduciary responsibilities of cold AC, care, obedience, loyalty, disclosure, accounting, and confidentiality. How we get that, or how it's conferred to us is the term. When they confer special agency, they do it through a listing agreement or a buyer's agency agreement. So there in your book and on the overhead, we're going to talk about 3 different types of listing agreements. So on this side over here, I want to put listing. And the first one is called the exclusive right to sell. Exclusive right to sell. Exclusive meaning I am the only agent that has the exclusive right to market this property for sale. The fact that they signed the listing form gives me procuring cause. Remember, we talked about what procuring cause. The state looks at a listing agreement like this. That I walked up to some door and went, hey, you're going to sell your house today, and you're going to use me to do it. And they said, oh, okay. Okay. So the fact that I got them to sign the listing agreement will make me the procuring cause on this sale, at least on the listing side. Okay? The exclusive right to sell is the big mamaluca. We've talked about this. Real estate has big ones and then ones underneath it. Here we go again. The exclusive right to sell. It is the most protective of the agent. This is the form that protects me the most. And what I mean by that is, when this house sells, I get my commission no matter what. It doesn't matter who brings the buyer. If I bring the buyer, I get paid. If another agent brings the buyer, I get paid. If the seller himself brings the buyer, I get paid. If Santa Claus brings the buyer for Christmas, I get paid. I am the exclusive agent, and I get paid no matter what. The simple fact I got them to sign the listing makes me the reason they sold their house. I can be golfing in Hawaii, and Leslie call me and go, hey, we got an offer on this house and we're closing. Okay, I get paid. And in that listing agreement was that commission that we did the math on a couple units ago. That's 6%. All right, I get paid. It's called exclusive right to sell. It is the most protective, and because of that, it actually, yeah, I just forgot what I was going to say. It's the most protective. That train took a left turn. Wow. Thank goodness I already got my license. These exclusive listings also, remember, have to be in writing. Statute of frauds. You cannot have an oral listing agreement. Must be in writing. You will get them to sign something. Oh, I know where I was going. It's the most protective, and because it's the most protective, it literally is the only form we have. In Indiana, our zip forms, which you will get as part of your membership to MyBor, this is the only form. You want to use one of the other methods, you actually have to change this form because we don't advocate these other two very often, okay? So the second one that we have is called an exclusive agency listing agreement. Exclusive agency. Now, I know what you're thinking. Raymond, there must be a difference, otherwise they'd be the same one. Yes, there is a slight difference. The exclusive agency says there must be an agent on both sides of the table for me to get paid. Or the either way to look at that is I get paid a commission no matter what, except, here's the only exclusion, if the seller himself finds the buyer. So if I bring the buyer, I get paid. If you, as another agent, bring the buyer, I get paid. If the seller himself finds the buyer without the use of me or you, no commission gets paid. No commission gets paid. So if I've got a guy that's, say, under exclusive agency, and in the seller standing out on the driveway, sweeping the driveway, and some jogger runs by and says, hey, I'll buy your house, and the seller goes, sure, I'll sell it to you, no commission would be paid on that deal because the seller found the buyer himself. All right? So what's the obvious question here? Why would I do that? Once again, I will tell you there's no form for this. There is one perfect example that this might be used for. When you get started in your career, your managing broker is going to tell you there are two great warm leads for you to start working on. A warm lead, you guys know what cold calling is? Cold calling means they don't know who you are. You just pick up the phone, hey, I'm Raymond Monson. A warm lead is somebody that is interested in selling their house. They're just not using you to do it. So who would that person be, most notably? Who would do what? For sale by owner, exactly. That's a warm lead. That's somebody that wants to sell their house, but they're not using an agent. So what you would do is say, I'll tell you what, obviously your first attempt would be to try to get them to sell an exclusive right to sell. I want to list your house. I'm a real estate agent. I'm the best in the world. And he says, well, that's okay. But I've been selling bicycles all my life. I'm pretty sure I can sell the house. I'm not interested in signing that listing agreement. But instead of walking away, you could make him a deal. Tell you what I'll do then. Let's make a deal. Let me list your house, and if I bring a buyer, you'll pay me. But if you're so good and you bring the buyer, you don't have to pay me. That's exclusive agency. That's a good bet for us because we know we've got the MLS, we've got all kinds of these other things to do, places to promote, where typically what's he got to promote? Where do for sale by owners promote? Just the sign in the yard. And the 27 people that drive up and down his street are the only ones that see the house. So it's a good bet as a last resort. If it's somebody you can't get to sign an exclusive right, you can say, let's have a race. Let me list it. If I bring a buyer for you, you pay me. If you don't pay me. Usually it's used to placate or as a last resort. And like I said, we don't have a form for it. You would take that first form and at the very bottom write something like, hey, if the seller himself brings the buyer, then no commission will be due to the modeling group. So there's no form for that. We don't even like it that well. But it's good for this particular case. When you just can't get them to sign off on number one, you could always say, okay, I'll tell you what, let's make a deal and we'll do number two. All right? So that's the second one. The third one I want to talk about is what they call open agency. Open agency. Now, here's the funny thing about open agency. Open agency, the big deal with this is the seller can enter into as many open agencies as he wants. So he could potentially have a Keller Williams sign in his front yard, a Modular Group sign in his front yard, a Century 21 sign in his front yard, a Tucker sign in his front yard. All of those that agreed to sign the open with him. Whichever agency brings the buyer gets the listing side as well. All of the others get nothing. So basically what happens is, as an agent, you end up getting limited agency, which is what? What's limited agency? I represent the seller and the buyer on the same transaction, or you get nothing. So whatever sign that buyer calls, for example, let's go back to that example. Seller's driving by, he sees 27 million signs in the front yard, and he happens to remember the easy phone number. And he calls and says, hey, I saw your sign, I want to see your house. That agent then goes, okay, you know, I've got that house listed. You sign the limited buyer's agency agreement, and we'll write an offer. The other 26.99 million signs get nothing. It's whatever buyer, whoever brings the buyer gets the listing. The others get nothing. And he can enter into as many as he wants.
So they get both sides of
They get both sides of the deal.
selling and the listing.
They get the listing side, and because the buyer's the one that called them, they get the selling side. The other signs in the yard get nothing. So what you see is at midnight, everybody running out, moving their sign to the front. I'll move my sign to the front, so it's the first number. Typically, no agent in the world would ever do this sign, this deal. All right? Typically, no agent would ever do this deal. Because, hey, if there's 8 of them, I've got 1 in 8 chance of getting paid, and I don't want to spend a bunch of time to get paid. Technically, in our MLS system, you can't even do it anyway. Because once the first person lists it in the MLS by tax ID number, the second person goes and tries to list it, and they're going to go, hey, that house is already listed by Keller Williams. So you're going to have to jack with the tax ID number in the listing, which really frustrates people too. So technically, we can't even really do it in our MLS. So then let me ask you, why do we have this one? There's a very great scenario that this would be used in that you guys probably won't guess because you've never practiced. Not commercial. Commercial will play a role in the buyer side here in a minute. Think about a property that is sufficiently weird enough that you're not sure where the buyer's coming from. Gatlinburg. Here's a common one. Nashville, where I live. A lot of weekend cabins, a lot of things like that. Where's the buyer sitting? Maybe in Indy, right? Maybe in Bloomington. Maybe in Columbus. All of those are different MLS systems. So if the seller of that house only lists with a MIBOR agent, it can't be seen in Bloomington or other MLS systems because it's only in this one. An agent can be a part, but there's a long story we're not going to go into. Very few ever do because of you have to join and pay for each one, and you have to follow your managing broker. If they're not, then you have problems. It's all, suffice it to say, 99.98 of them are not. All right? I am, and the Modulin Group is, because I lived in Bloomington and worked in Indy. So I'm a member of both of them. But typically they are not. It's not county specific. There are 22 boards in Indiana, and they all represent a different regional area, like Greater Board of Lafayette does Lafayette and some of Lebanon, and then you got Fort Wayne Board, you got the Richmond Board, you got the Greater Southern Indiana Board. So what a seller would do potentially is say, okay, John, I'm only going to list, I'm going to have an open listing, but you're going to be my guy for MIBOR, and we're going to contact Raymond, who's going to be my guy for the Bloomington board. So now we have a 317 sign and an 812 sign, so both MLSs can search it and see it, and it helps the buyer out. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Helps the seller out by getting greater exposure. That's right. She couldn't buy in Bloomington because she couldn't get anybody in this MLS to show it to them. They don't have access. Now they can still buy and they can still represent you, but you can't see their MLS. You don't know any of the market down there, any of that. So what would happen is in this case, another good case would be when the Conseco home went for sale, Hilbert's, $25 million home. Where's the buyer sitting? Maybe in Chicago, California. So the open listing does have its unique place to be. You would never see an open listing like downtown Indy where every agent belongs to MIBOR. They're typically those fringe properties that might be sufficiently weird enough. Another good example might be a big commercial building or a big house right on the river of the Kentucky River. Because Jeffersonville, Indiana is different than Louisville. So you want both of them to see it, so you might list with one Indiana guy and one Kentucky guy as well. You can't do exclusive like that, because if the Kentucky guy brought the buyer, what's the Indiana guy going to say? I get paid no matter what. No matter what means no matter what. So they can't enter into two exclusive agencies or exclusive right to sell. They would have to enter into an open and do one for Indiana and one for Kentucky. So there is a use for it, but it's very infrequent. All right, let's change the audio.